Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable, the Regulation of Neurotechnology in Chile. We will examine key concepts and issues underlying the bill of law on neuroprotection of the Chilean Senate, whose current version is now under discussion in the Chamber of Deputies. This event kicks off the 2022 activities of the UAH Neuroethics Group and the ANID project exploring the conceptual foundations of neuro rights. The Neuroethics Group at Universidad Alberto Hurtado brings together researchers interested in the philosophical, scientific, and legal foundations and implications of the national legal frameworks for the regulation of neurotechnologies and digital technologies related to the human mind and brain. The roundtable will feature 3 national researchers, Pablo López Silva, Isabel Cornejo Plaza, and myself, and 4 international researchers, Arlene Salles, Philip Kellmeyer, Karen Rommelfanger, and Joseph Fins. The former will propose to the later philosophical, scientific, and legal questions that have been raised during the discussion of the Chilean project, with the aim of developing conceptual tools for addressing them. There are 5 key issues within the neuro rights debate that systematize the questions articulated by Isabel, Pablo, and myself. Number 1, neuro rights foundations. Do we need to articulate new rights? Number 2, globalization. Do we need international consensus regarding neuro rights? Number 3, neurotechnologies and consent. Does neurotechnology applications require some form of consent that is not covered by current regulations? Number 4, alternative or complementary approaches. That is, in addition to neuro rights, what other tools could be considered effective? And number 5, the scope of neuro rights. Where should we draw the line between legitimate and illegitimate neurotechnological applications? Now, my co-host, Professor Francisco Pereira, will present the panelists and rapporteurs. Before that, I will present Francisco. So, Francisco Pereira is an associate professor of philosophy, director of the Master in Philosophy program at Universidad Alberto Hurtado, and member of the Neuroethics Research Group in the same institution. He obtained his PhD in philosophy at King's College, London, and his research focuses on the philosophy of mind, particularly on metaphysical and epistemological problems of perception. During the last few years, he has carried out funded projects on the nature of attention and the philosophical significance of cognitive penetrability. Recently, he has published 2 books, Ver o Alucinar, una mirada introductoria a la filosofía de la percepción, y Ver no es creer, sobre el rol de los conceptos en la experiencia visual, 2021. Francisco, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abel, and hi everyone. I will present them, the main speakers and the interviewers. Let's start with Pablo. Pablo López Silva is an adjunct professor at the School of Psychology and research professor at the Institute of Philosophy, Universidad de Valparaíso, Chile. Pablo López Silva is a Master's of Research and a PhD in Philosophy at the University of Manchester, UK, and his areas of research are philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, psychopathology, and neuroethics. And he is right now the director of the project Fondesit, called The Architecture of Psychotic Delusions. So welcome, Pablo. Let's go with Isabel right now. Maria Isabel Cornejo Plaza has a BA in Legal and Social Sciences from the University of Chile, an MA in Private Law, and a PhD in Law, both from the University of Chile, with a doctoral internship at the Wejiro Center for Practical Ethics, University of Oxford. She is currently a full-time professor and researcher at the Universidad Autónoma de Chile and teaches courses in civil law, philosophical foundations of law, and ethics of artificial intelligence. She is also a member of the academic team of the Jean Monnet Share Project, the EU Fifth Freedom, funded by the European Union, where she coordinates the Neurolaw and Neurorights section. She permanently serves as an advisor for the Commission of Challenges of the Future Science, Technology and Innovation of the Senate of Chile, especially in the project of digital platforms and the protections of neurorights and mental integrity. Abel Wajnerman Paz is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Alberto Hurtado University here in Santiago, Chile. He obtained his PhD in philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires and was a CONICET and Fondesit postdoctoral fellow. His main areas of interest are the philosophy of cognitive neuroscience and neuroethics. He focuses on epistemic and conceptual issues related to neural coding, computation and information processing, the relation to mental capacities, specifically perception, thought, and consciousness, and their neuroethical implications regarding mental privacy, personal identity, and autonomy. His current ANID research project, called Exploring the Conceptual Foundations of Neuro Rights, aims to philosophically elucidate some of the key notions underlying the Chilean framework for the regulation of neurotechnologies. He advises on these ethical issues for governmental bodies in Chile and Argentina. Arlene Sales is a senior researcher at the Center for Research Ethics and Bioethics, CRB, at Uppsala University, and director of the Neuroethics Buenos Aires group in Argentina. Researcher and task leader in the Responsible Research and Innovation Work Package of the EU flagship Human Brain Project. She's an executive board member of the International Neuroethics Society, founding board member of the Institute of Neuroethics, and member of the International Brains Initiative Neuroethics Working Group. Sales received her MA and PhD in philosophy from sunny Buffalo in the United States. Joseph Fins is a professor of medical ethics and chief of the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College, where he also serves as a professor of medicine with tenure, professor of public health, and professors of medicine in psychiatry. Dr. Fins is an elected member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012, and is currently the president of the International Neuroethics Society. His current scholarly interests include ethical and policy issues in brain injury and disorders of consciousness, palliative care, research ethics in neurology and psychiatry, medical education, and methods of ethics case consultation. Karen Rommelfanger. She's a neurotech ethicist and strategist. She's founder and director of the Institute of Neuroethics, the first think tank wholly dedicated to neuroethics. Her lab, the Neuroethics and Neurotech Innovation Collaboratory, explores how evolving neuroscience and neurotechnologies challenge societal definitions of disease and medicine, cross-cultural neuroethics, and cross-sectoral neuroethics implementation. Dr. Rommelfanger maintains a professorship in Amory's Department of Neurology and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and at the Center for Ethics, where she founded the Neuroethics Program. She is also an executive board member of INS and founding board member of the Functional Neurological Disorders Society. She is a co-chair of the Global Neuroethics Workgroup of the International Brain Initiative. She is an appointed member to the NIH Brain Initiative Neuroethics Working Group and served as an ambassador to the EU Human Brains Project's Ethics Advisory Board. Dr. Philip Kallmeyer is a neurologist at the University Medical Center Freiburg, where he heads the Laboratory of Neuroethics and AI Ethics at the Department of Neurosurgery. As a neuroscientist, he works in the fields of neuroimaging and translational neurotechnology, in particular, the clinical application of brain-computer interfaces based on artificial intelligence. In his research on neuroethics, he works on the ethical, legal, social, and political challenges of neurotechnologies, large data and artificial intelligence in medicine and research. He is part of the board of directors of the International Society of Neuroethics. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you everyone for joining the roundtable. Well, we will begin with the first of the themes that we would like to discuss, which is, as I said, neuro rights foundations. And there is a first question that I think that is by Pablo Lopez Silva.
Yeah, well, thank you. We all know it's a honor to be here. So we are well aware of this crusade for the creation of a specific rights to protect citizens from potential misuses of neurotechnologies, the so-called neuro rights, okay, which is a whole debate. Of course, this process is not free from criticism. So some researchers have actually suggested that the whole crusade is redundant, and that the current legal frameworks could be actually extended in order to deal with more specific types of threat raised by the use of neurotechnologies. So I was wondering, what is your specific opinion about the justification of the creation of specific neuro rights? At the end of the day, my question is, what is so unique about neural data that current legal frameworks might not be able to cover or protect when it comes to protecting people, citizens, from misuses of neurotechnologies?
So feel free to answer if you want to address this question.
I can start saying a few things, if you don't mind. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for the lovely introductions to all of us. And I also want to say, this is kind of a detour, a little bit of a detour. I'm particularly delighted to be here because when I founded the first neuroethics research group in Latin America 10 years ago, it was pretty lonely, actually. And it took a while. And to now see that there are other neuroethics groups who are addressing all the ethical issues and regulatory issues and philosophical issues raised by neuroscience, and they're bringing all these concerns to the region. And in addition to that, to see that even it could be argued that Chile, to a great extent, is leading the discussion on a topic such as regulation of neurotechnologies is really extremely gratifying. Abel has been part of my group for a while, so I really wish you all the luck. And it's really very nice to be here. Now, on to the question, though. The way I see this, neuro rights are supposed to be a response to a problem. The problem, I think it would be nice to have a further reflection on what the problem is exactly. So it is clear to me, having been doing neuroethics for a very long time, being in different projects, doing work with a lot of people, many of whom are here, it is evident that advances in neuroscience and emerging neurotechnologies are going to raise a variety of issues, even though they are extremely beneficial. And we have to be very aware of the extent to which it is beneficial to know more about the brain. But indeed, there are some concerns. The thing is that when one talks about concerns, there seems to be a wide range of issues, all put in the same bag. So some people talk about breach of privacy, that's a concern, but others talk about radical alteration of human beings, and that's a different type of concern. So the way I see it, if we want to know, if we want to start even discussing the issue of whether neuro rights is a good answer, first, we really need to be clear as to what the problem is. And it seems to me that the problem has to do with protecting interests of people. And not all interests are the same. So what is my opinion? Well, my opinion is that this is extremely important. This is not a question of denying the importance of regulation. Of course, regulation is key, but I would like to kind of take it a step back and do a little bit more conceptual reflection on some of the issues. How do we understand the issues? What is really at stake? Why is it at stake? And then once we understand that, we can start talking about the different legal instruments. What are they? Why is it that existing instruments fail? How do they fail? Can they be improved, or we really need novel instruments? So one of the last part of your question is, what is so unique about neurodata? I think probably that's part of the question, as part of the issue as well, when we discuss neural rights. What is so unique, and why is it that it cannot be addressed or covered by existing regulatory frameworks? So it seems to me that that is part of a discussion, should not be the starting point or taken as a given. This should all be part of the discussion already. And I think that this is something that I would welcome, more discussion and less assumptions regarding some of the main topics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can I? Yeah, so you said something about protecting people's interests. There seems to exist some kind of confrontation between different frameworks. So the philosophical framework, the legal framework, the neuroscientific framework. Sometimes we tend not to use the same terms. So in the case we protect interests, how does that approach would kind of talk with how law works? Because sometimes in law, you protect something that might not be something like a conscious interest. So human rights, we protect human rights, even if people do not think about human rights. There is some kind of reflection about humanity and the human condition. So can you elaborate a little bit more about the protecting interest approach?
It seems to me, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, but it seems to me that rights are intended to protect fundamental interests of human beings. So that is the most stringent way in which you can do that is by saying that there are rights. And of course, rights are going to entail obligations from the part of others. And what I wonder many times is whether in the case of neuro rights and in the discussion of neuro rights, we're not taking as a starting point that all those interests are as fundamental, or some interests may be more fundamental than others. What is taken as the right to identity, that seems to be more constitutive and fundamental than the right to equal access to enhancement, for example, right? So they seem to be different interests. And what I find really interesting is, or what I think would require more discussion is exactly, I think what I'm calling for more granular reflection on interests and potential instruments to address, to protect those interests. It seems to me that to just say rights protect the person, that might be sometimes a little bit too vague in this context. I think that we might really need to be a little bit more careful and more, again, as I said, granular, really try to understand better what is at stake and how, what are the interests, why are they threatened, why is it that advances or emerging neurotechnologies threaten those interests? Is that a problem? Why is it a problem? And then, okay, so do we have existing frameworks that could be applied? So it seems to me that again, I'm not saying at all that actually rights might be the way to go. So I'm not saying that it might not, it might actually be the way to go. But what I would want to see is much more previous reflection on some of the main issues, more conceptual clarity regarding what is at stake, why, and then how to solve it. So that's basically the idea that I wanted to convey.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Philip wanted to talk in.
Yeah, I would strongly like to support what Arlene says here, that we need an incremental process where we start with inter- and transdisciplinary reflection and work on the conceptual foundations of the issues that are at stake. Then we look at the existing fundamental rights and human rights frameworks that we have internationally, but also in certain jurisdictions. And then we interpret these existing rights, whether or not they conform to or are commensurable with the kinds of interests that we want to protect by notions like mental privacy, cognitive liberty, and concepts that are at play here. And only then, and this requires a very granular and detailed legal analysis by legal experts, only then can we make an informed decision as a global community whether we need new fundamental rights. And the situation, as I see it now, and this is not untypical for human rights or the emergence of new rights, is that it often starts from bottom up by advocacy, in this case by scholars, neuroscientists, or ethicists. So this is in a sense a very typical situation here that we find in this whole neuro rights debate. But my sense is that at the moment the predominant mode is one of moving very quickly from advocacy to the implementation, in this case at national legislative levels. And I would therefore again strongly call for more nuanced process of multi-layered reflection, interpretation of existing rights, and then a process of deliberation internationally, whether or not new fundamental rights are necessary. And I have to speak on these issues also maybe later in the meeting, but I think we need this kind of step-by-step process. Otherwise, we might end up with a risky situation, because introducing new rights also carries risks. And we need to discuss this also.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm next or if Isabel is next. Were you next, Isabel?
Yes.
Okay,
well,
go ahead.
I wish to thank Abel, Francisco, and the organizations for inviting me to be part of this roundtable. And of course, the panelists for being with us today, and also the audience for sharing this session, a discussion, a topic of the utmost interesting both in Chile and internationally. Maybe this question is for Fins, and I would like to ask you about the what do we do when people cannot consent because of decisional incapacity, and the intervention we are proposing may provide information about their brains, what they are thinking and who they are. There is an upstairs, for example, in identified covert consciousness, but maybe this kind of legislation may make prohibited. For example, recently, legal provision contained in so-called patients' bills of rights was amended, prohibiting any type of biomedical research on patients who could not give their consent, even if the research was the only hope for the future therapeutic improvement. This article was recently modified to allow in a restricted manner the possibility of research on this age group. This modification was very necessary because the prevalence of Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases is very high in Chile. What do you think about it? And I ask you, Dr. Fins, because of your research on altered consciousness, vegetative states, and the right to die with dignity.
Well, I think it's the right to live with dignity, not necessarily to die with dignity. And that conflation of the right to die for this population has been the unintended consequence of the right to die movement, which I'm in favor of. But it occurred on the backs of people who had disorders of consciousness, some of whom were in fact not vegetative, but in what we now call the minimally conscious state. And that confusion hinges on this issue of covert consciousness. But I want to just loop back and frame this and go back to something, the last question and Arlene's comments about the need for more granularity in our ethical analysis. Because I think that some of this legislation, this intention, relates to a kind of a reactive paranoia about hypotheticals and not about the reality. And the reality is that there are real people who have real medical problems who could be harmed by a restrictive regime. And you know, I'm all in favor of cognitive liberty and freedom and you know, invalid search and seizure. That would be problematic. But I think to some extent right now that is a hypothetical risk. And I think we need to get to Arlene's point. As we think about rights, we need to think about rights in two ways. We need to think about positive rights and negative rights. The negative rights we probably all agree on. But what happens when hyper-regulation of the negative right impinges on the positive right, which is exactly what you were talking about, Isabel. So, you know, we create a regime where I can't do research on people who can't give consent. In fact, I was the neuroethicist on the first use of deep brain stimulation in the minimally conscious state. We published that in Nature in 2007, and I spent 10 years of my life figuring out a way to, you know, allow for research. Phase 1 research was more than minimal risk. It was an invasive technology without the consent of the individuals, and that was a lacuna in our regime. And the argument was this. And this was a 10-year process, and I'll summarize it, that we were confusing respect for persons, which is fundamentally what this regime is about, right? Respect for persons and about, you know, negative and positive rights. Respect for persons, we were confusing that with informed consent. It's one thing to not get consent from somebody who can give it, right? Or do something over their objection. It's quite another issue to seek to get consent for something that might hypothetically restore their agency. And that became the moral warrant for the intervention and for using legally authorized representatives to allow that research to continue. And what that did, potentially violating that individual's will, was we gave that person the ability to express his wishes and gave him voice in this study that we published. And so I think we need to be very, very careful about not creating additional barriers to important research that could undermine human flourishing. The next thing I want to just throw out there, because I think, you know, I've been, you know, my book was called Rights Come to Mind, Brain Injury Ethics and the Struggle for Consciousness. And that's not a commercial or anything, it's just the title. But and that was written 6 or 7 years ago. Since then, I've really become to realize that it's not so much rights, it's capabilities, like Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. It's not just the rights that people have, but rights that allow human flourishing. And I think the neuroprostheses that we're going to talk about today have the potential to improve welfare for individuals, human flourishing, who don't have hypothetical problems, but have real problems. And anything that would undermine that capability, right, which allows them to pursue their goals and their ends, I think becomes problematic. So I'm not against, you know, neuro rights, but I think, as Arlene very carefully and properly cautioned us, we need to be more prudential about jumping into this prematurely or without analytical rigor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we have now to move on and talk about our second topic, which is globalization. But before that, I just would like to mention that thinking about neuro rights is not only thinking about new rights. A way in which this task is being approached, both in Chile and Argentina, and perhaps also in Brazil, is as a reconceptualization issue. Which is updating on reconceptualizing existing our privacy, data privacy regulations, and so on. So just wanted to emphasize that there are different ways to approach.
Right. I would just say the other reconciliation, as we think about how it harmonizes with other legal regimes, is the UN Convention on Human Rights and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we need to look at this in a lot of different places for reconciliation, because I think disability law is incredibly powerful as a vehicle to restore justice and to regulate this, and that includes empowering people who are affected by these technologies to have a voice in the legal the legislation. so that if it means that your child is not going to get a neuroprosthetic because it's now restricted, those families need to have an opportunity to voice their objection. And in a democratic process, that would be important.
Thank you very much. So, well, we are going to move on to our second topic, which is globalization. And Isabel.
Okay, I will do the answer. What will be the challenge that globalization imposes on neuroprotection regulations? Could it be that the taxonomy of neuro rights is still being reconfigured at the global level, and some of them could be submitted under existing rights, for example, the right to privacy, while other neuro rights could disappear, such as the right to free will, since it's more of a prerequisite for the conception of a human right rather than a right itself? Karen, please.
Hi. Thanks for that question. And again, thank you for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here with so many bright minds and to be part of this inaugural or first main event for UAH. It's really a pleasure. I want to also reinforce what has been said by others, that as we think about the context of this conversation of neuro rights and neuroprotection, that the intent is clearly good. You know, there is an intent to protect people in a way. There is an intent to try to empower and be proactive in a sense. And I think what is troubling is the process that's been undertaken so far. The process has betrayed actually some uncustomary and probably unsettling practices in drafting any kind of major legislation and amendments. So again, it's not that neuro rights in themselves are bad, but the process is extremely important. And this relates also to the globalization aspect. So as a reminder, you know, doing something like creating an amendment for a constitution or creating laws, you know, creating new rights, you know, especially more than one, even on tops of what Joe had mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and others. That is many years of diverse scholars from around the world coming together, public engagement with numerous voices. You know, while there is urgency, if you're looking for a quick fix now, I think pointing to what Philip was saying, we need a multi-layered process and not a quick, here are suddenly some new rights. Particularly, as Joe said too, when the voices of those for whom these rights are being made or will be foisted upon are not included in the process. And to be clear, even the best human rights law and even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been plagued with trouble and has been criticized for not being inclusive enough as well. So the United Nations in general even has been criticized for having a largely Western dominated perspective, and where rights conversations are really based on Western philosophical notions of the individual rights. And this has alienated many countries and entities and made it very confusing, even in thinking about practical day-to-day implementation. And so I'll give an example is, gosh, now I can't remember how far back that was. Was it 2014, maybe? 1947. Oh. 2013, I think, was when China passed its first ever Mental Health Care Act. And it did this under the duress of the United Nations and kind of rightful pressures that its mental health care system was being used in ways to police and to constrain, and from different political orientation to non-compliance at work, you know, egregious, right? But then for those really trying to implement mental health and trying to build hospitals and offer care for still a highly worldwide stigmatized disorder, saying things like, we need to protect the individual and their privacy when they come into the hospital was totally impractical. And I went in, even being somebody who's half Chinese, went into these hospitals with my Western ethicist training and my Western scientist training. And I went in, I said, how do you protect the privacy of individuals who come in here and want to check themselves in, right? Because highly stigmatized disorder can stigmatize the whole family. And they asked me with great curiosity, how would they have gotten here? How would they even get better? Because typically the family comes together for the process of kind of diagnosing and bringing someone to the hospital. And the care program, even that they had developed, was a collective effort. So here's just one example of a very well-intentioned pressure, and then kind of this bending to the will of this power. And keep in mind, science and all of this is all tied into political power and economic prestige. You know, so no, there was pressure to do this, but then now of a really well-meant effort has just become useless, right? So we don't want to have that same kind of issue. And Joe also mentioned similar problems with that. And we also know, if we think about laws, as we're looking at this laws, and I hope we carefully look through them. I know UNESCO has already put out its report where it called for a mandate for other countries to look into their laws or gaps. There are concrete, we're missing legal elements, there are gaps. And then there's the shoulds. What should we be applying? How should we be interpreting this? And we need to think carefully about that as well, because we know that a lot of neuroscience findings, as they find our ways into our lives, are really not just about science or a law, they're about the ethics of it. How do we define life and death? It's not a biological question. This really ultimately comes down to an ethical argument. So I think there's several considerations, and all of those will be informed by a cultural lens.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think that Aline raised her hand. Oh, okay.
That was a question for before, but actually I can still, because I was thinking about what Joe said and what Karen just said, and obviously that is correct, and I agree. And I wonder whether to focus on capabilities, going back to capabilities come to mind instead of rights come to mind. And what Karen just said about, which is absolutely correct, about the fact that we may be already, when we talk about neuro rights as being a solution, we may be inadvertently kind of imposing a culturally shaped understanding of what a solution is. And I wonder whether to shift the focus from rights to capabilities could be a way to go. But then I wonder, what would that mean from the legal aspect to shift the discussion? Because it seems that legally rights are clearer than protection of capabilities. So that was my general question.
I just to respond to that, I think rights are necessary, but they're not sufficient.
Right.
But I think it's curious, and I would love my Chilean friends to comment on this. Isn't it curious that a rights declaration is coming out of a country that had a long history with a dictatorship? Is it in a way compensatory and reactive? If you've been deprived of rights, it's something you'd really want to affirm. And maybe you don't see around the corner because it's necessary and you don't see that it's not sufficient, or you don't see the traps. I mean, some rights are better than no rights. And if you live under a dictatorship, you're under that situation where basic rights are not being fulfilled. So I wonder if you guys could comment on why Chile and why Argentina, for that matter, it's a parallel universe. Could you comment on that?
That's a pretty good question.
Yeah. Maybe a political issues more than theoretical aspect.
Yeah,
Abel, Pablo, Francisco.
I agree.
Yeah.
We were, well, at least Francisco, Isabel, and me, we were born and raised in Chile. We didn't have like a completely technological society or anything like that. The very concept of neurotechnology is not part of the common knowledge. And one of the things that is pretty interesting about the whole neuro right crusade is that it is experienced as really alien for general society. It's like it's something very like obscure, very. In all honesty, I think there is a lot of political things going on, like giving a good impression, preparing a set of elements to influence in different discussions. I mean, something like creating a whole position on this issue as a political thing. We actually will, Abel, Isabel, and Francisco, we were part of this whole process of discussing things surrounding the creation of the law. And there are a number of lawyers and philosophers trying to inform the discussion, but sometimes you finally collide with this wall built by politics, because giving a certain impression is more important from a political point of view. There were some good discussions. We were heard sometimes, but it's true. It's true. It sounds like this parallel universe actually for people in Chile, living in Chile, and it's an interesting thing because it's actually related to what I was going to ask, and it has to do with some social problems related to this neuro-right crusade, because a popular proposal for the creation of neuro-rights tries to secure this right to access to neurotechnologies, right? So in legal terms, this would mean that local governments should secure equal access to neurotechnologies for all citizens. So that's part of a popular proposal, and it was actually included in I think in one of the first drafts of this project here in Chile. So, but now considering that different governments manage completely different budgets, do you think that rights like this one would increase social inequalities between countries? Because some countries would be able to secure this right, the wealthiest, while others, they wouldn't have that possibility in terms of finances, in terms of budget. So what do you think about the potential social political problems that might derive from this specific type of proposal?
Yes, Philip, please.
Yeah, if I may say a few words, because I think this is absolutely crucial and important. But maybe first a very short personal note, because it's almost 20 years now that I spent formative time in Chile in the Programa Regional de Bioética of the Pan-American Health Organization. And I encountered in my time there, I had so many wonderful conversations on human rights. And this is why I also remember that the history, that Chile also has a proud history when it comes to human rights, because Hernán Santa Cruz was one of the original drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was, I think, permanent delegate to the United Nations from Chile, and was one of the original drafters. So it even precedes, and I think Joe is absolutely right that the dictatorship then sort of turbocharged what was already there. But I think one can safely say that Chile has a really long-standing and proud history of progressive lawmaking and progressive engagement with human rights, and maybe neural rights is now an expression of that. But in terms of whether or not these kinds of rights may exacerbate existing injustices in terms of access, I would say absolutely. And this is coming back to this notion of risks associated with human rights, new rights. Because if you have a larger number of human rights, you can have conflicting rights, you can have high burden in terms of compliance and monitoring, which may compromise the effective protection of those rights, especially in countries that do not have the necessary governance infrastructure to ensure that these rights are also enforced. So introducing new rights doesn't automatically strengthen the human rights system, but may also weaken it, which is a fact that needs to be considered. And so I would say we need to make sure that the priorities in terms of the anthropological goods, as I would maybe call it, things like freedom of thought, mental privacies, the things that we care about, are really framed in the sense that Joe also said, capabilities, human flourishing. So making sure that rights enable people to live a full life and to have access to fundamental goods, healthcare, and technology is not always the solution, but may also exacerbate existing injustices. So in a sense, we do not only face the problem of legal solutionism, thinking that new rights automatically make the world a better place. But if this is also done in the context of technological solutionism, in which you operate under the assumption that new technologies like brain-computer interfaces will solve problems that might be better addressed by social policies, political processes, we need to be mindful to not fall into this trap to think that existing injustices can be undone or improved by either legal or technological solutionism. So I would strongly advocate that we make sure that these, whatever they are, whether they are soft law instruments that interpret existing human rights or actual new fundamental rights, that they are oriented towards maximizing human capabilities and flourishing, and not enabling certain types of technologies that may also have downsides and dual use problems.
Thank you, Philip. Karen wanted to say something.
I just wanted to add to that. The question was about securing budgets and with different governments having different budgets for technology. I think I would also add that some of this new governance in Chile actually can result in a decrease of an already small neurotechnology community. We know that many neurotechnologies that end up coming to people often, or technologies in general, aren't often just created for clinical purposes first. Many of them are, but many of them also aren't. And so you start to foreclose certain opportunities for companies to grow and establish themselves, or to empower local people, researchers, to develop. If the laws are too strict, they're not even they're strict, they are simultaneously too much and too little. So painting with too broad a brush forecloses a lot of opportunity, and then without specificity, you start being able to not really enforce. And we already have, to be clear, we don't have the problem that AI has with over 200 sets of ethical guidelines and other types of norm setting and soft law instruments with no mandatory implementation of them. But we do have at least over 20. And our group are actually at the Institute of Neuroethics. One of the first projects of our lab was to do the first analysis of existing consensus level neuroethics guidances. And I can share that link in the chat. It's not published at this time, but we've made it openly accessible while it's under review. And I think this leads to kind of some other questions of, in that analysis, what we've realized, the additional problem is they all kind of say the same thing, but they often are unintentional in their form as an instrument and unintentional of the person or actor or institute to implement that. And I, to be clear, have been guilty of being a part of those myself. So that we have a mismatch in many of the instruments with, you know, our for, in this case, I asked the same question of and I'm exploring this right now with existing soft law tools. Is this the right tool for this group? On what timeline is this tool useful? And who is this really going to empower? And even regionally, where is this tool beneficial? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in December of 2019 adopted as a legal instrument its recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And this is the first of its recommendations to actually create ethical principles for an emerging technology. And now they're in this phase of by 2024, all member countries are supposed to report back on how they utilize technology. And there are many Central American countries also involved in that document and on the steering group of that implementation. And I am also a part of developing that strategy. And what's kind of been interesting to hear is this, with a lot of people who get excited about ethics, they think the only way that we know ethics was impactful if it turns into regulation. And so I think a lot of that is where this neural rights piece came from. I think in its inception was a lot of the individuals initially interested, enthusiastic about neuroethics and the importance of it. And I'm grateful that they see it, started to say the first thing we need to do is create some sort of regulation. But if you're trying to be fast, human rights is not the way to do it. If you need an immediate step now, we need to be looking at professional societies, codes of conduct for individuals, for companies, thinking about what can we do now for norm setting and what are the hyper local ways actually that we can enforce these. And then thinking about building a longer term strategy towards rights or standards. And as an example, there's another group I'm working with who's trying to work towards socio-technical standards or ethical standards for neurotechnologies, just like you have standards for engineering. But this process will take 1 year approval from the standards body to even begin, 1 to 3 years process for us to build the standards, and then the standards will be reviewed every 8 years. So you can imagine with the timeline of technology, how useful some of those standards might be in an immediate situation. So we need to match the actor with the instrument and also the actor and instrument with the timeline. And I think that's something to explore also in this broader neural rights conversation. Maybe this neural rights exploration is good for us to keep iterating on, and we need to think about what are the appropriate tools and needs right now for particular groups.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think that there were our possible interventions, but we have to move to the next issue, which is neurotechnology and consent. And here, Pablo had a very interesting question.
Yeah. Well, we know that consent is already an issue of debate in medical sciences. We are well aware of the existing epistemic inequalities in current societies, likely major degrees of understanding the content of a consent form might be conditioned to higher levels of education or that type of element or something like that. But even if this is true, understanding how the brain works and the potential side effects of the use of neurotechnologies from a commercial point of view is going to be a hard task. So what do you think about the ways in which the very process of consent should be rethought in light of potential commercial applications of neurotechnologies, how do we really ensure that subject understand what are they signing for?
There's an old paper by James Strain, who was a great lover of the Spanish-speaking world. Actually, he was a former priest, got his PhD, I believe, in Spain, worked with Laín and Trago, and was a friend of Dan Callahan's. And he wrote a paper, I believe it was, somebody can look it up, 1984 in JAMA, and he talked about sliding scales of competency, Pablo. And the idea was that you titrate the level of what he called evidencing understanding to the significance of the decision at hand. So, for a trivial kind of acquiescence or something, perhaps you could do it online and just check a box, because that could be evidence of understanding. But the more significant choices would require a more robust interface, where the person who was consenting to whatever they're consenting to could explain their rationale, could be questioned, and could evidence understanding. And he called that the sliding scale of competence. So there's a good example of how a framework that's almost 40 years old is still operative, still would work, but how it gets operationalized in the technology would need to be understood. It's more than just saying I'm not a robot.
Yeah.
that wouldn't suffice. But I do think that one of the things that people like Henry K. Beecher, who wrote about consent, was that he said this could not be delegated. And he said the best defense against informed consent not happening is the responsible investigator. Now, notwithstanding that Beecher has recently come under scrutiny for doing studies without consent himself, and that's why the Hastings Center took away the name of the Beecher Prize and now made it the Founders Award. I say that as a board member of the Hastings Center, as part of those discussions. Notwithstanding that, it's important that we have enough human contact. Machines don't have integrity, right? People can have integrity or not, and so we need a human interface, especially for the more serious kinds of conversations. And the last point I'd make, and I think this gets back to something that Karen was talking about as well, is the social context, is that scientific literacy is the backdrop against so much of this, that if you don't have a scientifically literate society, and then you impose these neurotechnology consent mechanisms, it's a recipe for total misunderstanding. And it turns consent into a platitudinous exercise and not a way to respect human dignity.
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, that's exactly something I was thinking about in terms of how Chilean education, for example, hasn't been populated by conceptual or concepts about technology and how this might interact with this type of bill. So thank you.
We have a second related question by me about consent and neural data, and mostly about data in general. I wanted to emphasize that some of the problems that are related to neurotechnology are often problems or issues that are also common to digital technologies. So that's why perhaps it's also a good strategy to think about those kind of technology together, which is something that is happening in Chile. There is another project in which Isabel is participating, which is oriented to regulate or think about how to regulate digital platforms. And so in relation to this, I wanted to focus on issues related to our privacy laws and the kinds of data on which new technologies and digital technologies rely, which are not covered by our privacy laws. And this is a specific case in which I think that the legal response must be part of the reaction to these issues. Specifically, there are two kinds of data on information whose processing and sharing do not require consent from data subjects, according to our privacy regulation, at least in Argentina and Chile. Firstly, once a data subject consents to the recollection and processing of her data, information that is inferred from such data through, for instance, data mining, can often be applied, processed, and shared without her consent. In these cases, intellectual property and trade secrets regulations favor the rights of the data controller. So mental and psychological information inferred from neural data may fall under this category. Secondly, given that the purpose of profiling is classification and not identification, profiles often do not include personal information. In these cases, profiles fall outside the scope of our data regulations in Chile and Argentina, for instance. However, the non-personal information used in psychological profiling could constrain the possibilities of interaction with other people, institutions, through digital platforms of a subject that depend on her control over her projected identity. So, do you think that the scope of consent could be expanded in our privacy regulations to include these kinds of data, or would these have problematic implications for neuroscientific research and neurotechnology applications, such as those emphasized by Karen and Shou?
Yeah, so if I may, I can mainly speak from the perspective, obviously, of German and European data protection laws, so the general data protection regulation, which I think was a significant step forward in having a more clearly defined legal landscape for data protection. And one large shift in terms of previous legal regimes was that GDPR now demands that intended use is specified, can be one use or multiple uses, but it doesn't automatically assume the kind of broad consent for data use that you had in previous iterations, previous situations, especially in sort of biomedical research, where if people gave up their biomedical data, it was assumed that one could do research on these data for many years and in multiple projects. Nowadays, the demands for ongoing consent or secondary use, as it's sometimes called, of biomedical data have become much higher here. And so there's a very lively discussion now in the medical informatics community and biomedical research community on whether and how broad consent could be used in sort of tightly controlled data ecosystems like in biomedical research centers. But I think the real issue, and where it really gets complicated, is that we now have the line between what is clearly biomedical research and what is sort of consumer-directed devices and research that is being done on consumer data, like the Cambridge Analytica situation and all that, makes it very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all approach, because there, in a sense, it's not meaningful anymore to distinguish between, say, health-related data or non-health-related data, or biomedical data or non-biomedical data, because many digital data can now be used to compute inferences on our behavior and make predictive models, even if they're not directly about our body, even if they're not biomedical data in the classical sense. And so I think what we need is to also bring in other instruments like consumer protection laws that make sure that the types of devices, for example, consumer neurotechnological devices that come on the market, are really doing what they're saying they're doing, so that they have a vetting process that may be akin to sort of medical device regulation that makes sure that even that from a scientific point of view, the devices are vetted, and that data handling is made transparent and is maybe compliant also with the kinds of data protection that we now demand in other contexts. So I think, as you say, Abel, there's a lot of room and a lot of necessity for legal harmonization. But I think the problem is really this gray area of sort of somehow health-related research, which actively avoids medical device regulation and software as medical device. And so we need to attend, I think, to this situation, make sure that everything that happens in the consumer domain also happens in responsible ways, and that we have effective legal tools to make sure that people's interests are not violated.
Thank you very much, Philip. So yes, I agree that that health information and non-health related information, the line between them is increasingly blurred, and also between sensitive information and non-sensitive information, likewise, perhaps. So that's what I believe that perhaps we need to think about new categories for understanding privacy. We have, I don't know if there's, Karen, please.
I think that was a really interesting question about inferred information, because that is where the gaps are, not just the data itself, but the inferred information. And to kind of add to what Philip was saying, and what you were saying as well, Abel, about this line that is not so bright in between medical and non-medical, there's also this, we carry these phones in our pockets, these pocket sensors that have multiple ways of tracking movement, typing speed, all kinds of things that we voluntarily ask our device to do, or that we ask Apple to do. And it's likely that it's not just neurotechnology we have to worry about in isolation, because it probably will never really act in isolation in the consumer pocket. It will be through Bluetooth, which is very convenient, but the least secure type of wireless connection we have. And many BCIs are actually built on that. They're going to be connected to the internet. They're going to be connected to phones. They're going to be connected to Alexa. All these devices that we are really unclear on where the third-party tracking is for all of those. And there are many, I don't know how many consumers there are of Alexa today. Not to mention that it's non-medical data is becoming medical data, and non-medical data that we offer for free, like insights into our mood status or social media, that are active sources of research for people to identify trends and predict mental health statuses, particularly now in a post-COVID world. This is something that might even be really helpful in identifying trends. So we have to think about not just what we scope as brain data, although it's likely that there is something more sensitive and unique about that, maybe in degree versus kind, but also in its networked effects with all of these other technologies. And that's kind of, scoping out just the neuro piece in governance might not really adequately prepare us for this future, this networked future.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Philip, would you like to comment?
No, just maybe bring the notion of informational privacy into play, to say that rather than caring about only caring about the data or caring about mental privacy as an abstract concept, ultimately what it boils down to is what kind of information about themselves are people do people agree with as being accessed, made available, collected. And so I think that it can be reduced to this notion of informational privacy, but we need to look at notions like data ownership, data stewardship and things like that. But ultimately it comes down to what kinds of information and what information about yourself do you want to be available to what actor, under which circumstances and conditions, and these need to be fleshed out legally. And data is one aspect, and the mental realm is one aspect, but ultimately it's about information about you as a person that you care about, I think.
Yes, Karen, please.
I wanted to also add that if maybe I'll share a link for our viewers. Arlene and her crew have created a wonderful data protection and privacy opinion for the Human Brain Project that they put out in anticipation of the GDPR. And I always reference that, and I also share that with a lot of public and private sector companies, because it lays out a bit of what, in more detail, what Philip mentioned there, that their privacy is not a monolith. There's informational privacy, decisional privacy, physical privacy. And when we have a blanket statement about privacy, we don't offer the, we don't honor the differences in the very important differences in degree, maybe not kind, that matter when implementing this kind of governance. And that is the type of conversation I think we need to be bringing back into the public engagement sphere as we try to empower individuals to understand what in the world is this alien technology, as Pablo was saying. We also should offer an opportunity to weigh in on the types of privacy concerns they have and not make decisions for them. And to the global piece of this that was asked earlier, there are nuanced differences. Everybody across the globe, there are laws for privacy, but the ways they are enforced and even the types of privacy that they would privilege over others is important to consider in practical application. And so these are the things that I think would be really enriching to the conversation around neuro rights and neuro governance.
Thank you very much, Karen. We had another question, but I think that Isabel has already asked it regarding consent, that it was for show. I don't know if you want to add something about consent before we move to the next.
I think we can move on.
Okay. Well, our fourth topic was alternative or complementary approaches to neurotechnology regulation. The first question was by Isabel, I think.
Yeah. Well, in addition to neuro rights, what other legal tools could be considered effective in protecting people from the disruptive use of neurotechnologies? And Philip mentioned HIPAA and GDPR as a legal regulation of data governance. Do you think that neurodata could be included as a sensitive data, or it could have another specific category?
Well, my sense is from my discussions with people in the medical informatics, bioinformatics community, again, that it doesn't make sense to now add new categories of data to these regulatory regimes or regulatory tools. Rather, we need to think about ways how we can, again, as Joe said, I think is very important from the beginning, how we can protect the kinds of interests that we care about in how we want to protect citizens from potentially harmful effects of digital technologies, neurotechnology. And so I think ultimately you will need a multi-level approach and using very different legal and regulatory tools, and data protection is just one tool, but I think consumer protection laws can be very effective, monopoly laws can be very effective in addressing problems in monopolization of data. So again, in this sort of growing market of neurotechnology for consumers, you find a lot of, let's say, scientifically questionable, unvetted devices that make bold marketing claims, even whole companies that make bold claims about what they can do with their devices. And if nobody resists these claims and tests them and finds ways to validate these claims in a scientific manner, they stand unchallenged, and companies can go about and basically defraud consumers by selling technology that's not very helpful and could potentially be harmful. And I think companies know very well that it's much easier to market these devices as non-medical by marketing them as sort of for wellness, well-being, mindfulness, meditation, and so forth. It's a little bit like the supplement market for vitamins. It's totally unregulated. Companies can make huge amounts of money with these supplements, and some supplements, some vitamins, if you take too much of them, are actually medically harmful. And so or homeopathy, other paramedical situations. If you have no clear vetting process of whatever is offered to consumers, it will be clear that people will be harmed because either their expectations are disappointed, or because they are actively harmed by say, brain stimulation devices, or because they're using them in a vulnerable state. Because I think vulnerability is a super important issue here, because many people that are using neurotechnology do it out of a vulnerable situation, because they might have mental health issues that are below the sort of threshold of clinical care, but still relevant and still and makes them vulnerable in certain ways. Might be youth, elderly people, very different vulnerable groups in society that might be harmed by these technologies. And so I think we need a very strong and scientifically based regime for vetting these devices. It would be very obvious, very easy, very clear step. Yeah.
Can I just jump in real quickly? I think Philip's mention of drug supplements is incredibly important. I was appointed by President Clinton to the White House Commission on Complementary and Alternative Medicine Policy, and we looked in great detail at this bill and law in the United States called DSHEA, the Drug Supplement Health Education Act. And this is what regulates supplements. And a supplement is something that doesn't make a medical claim. And that sounds good because you're not making a medical claim about something that hasn't been vetted. But what goes with that is that you also are not obliged to disclose risks. And so because it's not medical, so it can't have a risk. And so in a sense, you've created the worst of all possible worlds, especially if there's a potential harm there. And I think that if some of these non-medical devices, because they don't make a medical claim, are not therefore obligated to disclose potential risks or complications or interactions. A lot of the supplements in themselves are not dangerous, but in combination with other drugs, they are. And you could well imagine that some of these devices in combinations with medical conditions or other medications or other devices could become problematic. So one of the issues that we identified was that there is a regulatory space between the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Trade Commission. And these devices sort of operate in that gray zone in between. And I suspect the same problem is going to happen for some of these non-medical devices. And that brings up the question of who is going to enforce the regulation and oversight of these devices, and who's going to pay for that oversight. And I would propose that we look very carefully at taxing some of these devices, like Google glasses and things like that, a very small percentage to pay for the enforcement mechanisms to make sure that people are not defrauded and the public is protected from harm. And I think we need to probably create a new category for devices which aren't drugs, aren't medical devices, but still have significant impact on health and well-being. And I think that would be a very constructive regulatory space to work in, versus this nebulous thing about neuro rights, because it's a real concrete problem.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I think that Karen wanted to say something. I wanted just to make a quick remark regarding that. One idea regarding that gray zone was to apply the medical model, the idea of the same regulations that are applied to medical devices, apply them to devices that claim it to be not medical. That was part, I think, of the original idea regarding neuro rights, and was an idea that is applied in the current version of the Chilean neuroprotection bill in some way, because the National Institute of Health according to this proposal, is the one who has to approve and set the regulations for neurotechnological devices, medical or non-medical. I don't know if you think that this could be
the United States NIH doesn't do that. No, yours.
Yes, in Chile.
Okay, Chile, right. Yeah, the problem with putting it into the medical space is you may be over-regulating it, and that creates an evasion, an incentive to not even disclose, to just turn it into something else, and may actually be counterproductive. I just think this goes back to Arlene's original and Karen's original point. Phil, everybody's making the same point. We need to study this more and avoid the unintended consequence of creating a structure that makes it worse, conceivably. I think we have a diagnosis. There's a problem here. We just don't know what the therapy is.
Yeah. Maybe as a quick point, I think, yeah, putting it in the medical device bracket won't help. And it also creates the problem that you would then have to vet every kind of digital technology with whom people interact, whether or not they might have harmful unintended effects. Like consider the effects of Instagram on body image, harmful effects of social media on mental health. You could, in the end, this would be sort of an endless process in which you would have to vet everything with respect to whether or not it may have harmful effects on health. And so I think putting it in the medical bracket would create more problems. So we need to find that. But there are clear solutions by having industry norms that clearly map how companies need to show evidence for the claims that they make in ways that is just not the case at the moment in the consumer space, just mostly and totally unregulated.
Thank you, Philip. Karen, please.
Oh, I was just going to add that it's really important to, I think part of the issue in these conversations is we make it very black and white. So it's medical or it's not, or it's hard regulation or it's not, when there is a wealth and a whole science behind soft law, as I'm sure Isabel would agree. And the science of soft law actually around emerging technologies is that at least the going theories and models are that soft law governance is really the way to go. But even within that one, there isn't a consistent definition of what soft law is. So people use different definitions for what that means with variable enforceability. And also thinking through really the reality that legal order doesn't necessarily mean social order, especially with emerging technologies. So how are we going to define that? And again, that goes back to making sure we talk to the experts who know. So it's great that we have ethicists and scientists in the room. We probably need more legal scholars. We probably need more human rights scholars actually talking about this stuff. You wouldn't ask an ethicist to talk about a scientist's work for them. I mean, even though we certainly try to learn about it, and some of us are trained as scientists. So I think that's something important to make sure we have the very basic, simple skill set in the room, but then also to think more creatively. I mean, and these are being piloted. There are regulatory sandboxes. There are these spaces big space between soft law and hard law. And we just have to match the instrument with the actor and the context. And that's really the hard work to do, not just come in and I think this is something that also Joe said, a lot of this conversation, unfortunately, is being fueled by a lot of paranoia that is far away from the reality of the technology and stands to really foreclose opportunities for people to have life-transforming technologies. I mean, that's the thing I worry about most in this case, that we will scare people so far that we will shut down opportunities to reduce massive suffering and opportunity and create great opportunity. And I feel that especially acutely for countries that do not have rich neurotechnology development yet. And how are we closing the door to them so early and creating a very short future for being a leader in the space? So that's, I think, something that we have to think of as we are importing, ideals into a variety of countries. I mean, it's that we haven't even tested yet, as well in a variety of settings. I think that's the challenge.
It could also make the population fearful of the technologies, right? If the regulations are so stringent And it just feeds into the hyper skepticism. People are, people don't want to take a COVID vaccine, right? That's been so well tested and validated. Can you imagine if we say we're gonna do some deep brain stimulation, whatever? It'll just fuel even more concerns, even if it's safe and effective. So I think be very careful because people are on edge, especially after the pandemic. They look at risks and benefits through the prismatics of their politics, and that could lead to all kinds of distortions.
Thank you, Joe. We had a question for Arlene. Wanted to say something.
I kind of following the thread. Another thing that really worries me also is that I agree with you in that people might be really very scared, and particularly after the pandemic and so on. But I think that this also shows that there has been something missing in the discussion. There is a reason why the OECD and the European Commission and a number of brain initiatives are putting a lot of emphasis on engagement, public engagement. And I think that this raises the issue of who are the experts. Now, I'm not denying that obviously there are some people who are experts on certain areas, but I think that in our eagerness to talk with experts, we have forgotten many of those who are directly affected by this. And I haven't seen patients involved many times in these discussions. I haven't seen, certainly haven't seen the regular citizen involved in the discussion. And I think that is a problem. So what I think we should do actually is be more careful in trying to include different publics. So we communicate with them and we have a dialogue with them, which is not just telling them how things are, but also listening to their concerns, trying to see why they are afraid or concerned, or they have unrealistic expectations, because that can also happen, that they expect more than there is. And I think it's on us to a certain extent that these discussions have been held at a kind of a high level. People like neuroscientists and ethicists and philosophers and neurologists and so on. But then we have not, I think, paid enough attention to others who are definitely going to be impacted by not only the neurotechnologies, but also by neuro rights and whatever limitations of those neuro rights entail. And they will entail limitations because rights obviously automatically limit activities of others. So I think we have to do more in terms of engagement.
Thank you very much, Arlene. I think that Pablo had a question for Arlene, but I think it was already answered. Okay. Which is that the idea was basically what is missing within the neuro rights debate. I agree completely with what you say, Arlene, but this is a thing about which I think we should be careful, which is that there is a tendency in neuroethics to identify the perceived identity or perceived agency with identity and agency. So the perspective of patients or citizens in general, perhaps we have been discussing this a lot with Pablo. Perhaps the perceived concern is not identity to interfering on agency, identity, and so on. So I think that the perception is important and it's something that we should care about. But something sometimes tricky about asking people is that we have to be careful about what that implies about what we were discussing.
Can I give you an example? Let me go back to the opinion that Karen mentioned before. This is an opinion, a document prepared by the HPP, Data Protection and Privacy, right? And it's followed by an action plan. Now, when we started thinking, and this is again, as Karen indicated, pre-GDPR. So we had to kind of figure out what to do with the fact that many of, at the time, were the sub-projects of the HPP were very likely, some of them we knew for a fact, but others were very likely to let's say, restrict or at least compromise the privacy of a number of people. So we had to address this. So what did we do? Certainly, we put together a team of experts in STS and obviously in philosophy and neuroscience and so on. And we talked with each of the different SPs, sub-projects, the human brain, the mouse brain and so on. We talked with them to see what the issues were and so on. But ultimately, and of course, we had an important philosophical component, and that's when we used the distinctions that Karen just mentioned between informational, proprietary, physical and decisional privacy and so on. But there was a section of the report that focuses on what do people, or what kind of privacy are people concerned with? Now, the fact is that we were able to actually enter in a dialogue with a number of citizens on the basis of our research, and ultimately the recommendations were shaped, not determined, but shaped by that dialogue. So we knew when we recommended certain actions, we knew where people stood when it came to some what they feared, really. What kind of privacy breach did they fear? Because as we all know, people today seem to be pretty okay with, others knowing everything about them, but Yet, there were concerns about some research within the HVP. So the question was, okay, what is it? And that, I think, really enriched the final product. Now, we could have done it just from a purely philosophical, abstract perspective. But I think that just engaging with the public, seeing what European citizens were afraid of, why, it ended up that their main concern was decisional privacy. That's important. Because whatever measure we're going to take, we'll have to take into account that people appear to worry more about decisional privacy than about other types of privacy. So to that extent, I'm not saying that we should outsource, let the public do, no. But I'm saying that it is our work should be shaped by what the society that is going to be affected by these technologies think and fear. If we do not fully understand the fears and expectations, I think that we will not be able to do a job that is good enough. So that would be my take on this.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Now before moving to the last topic, please, Karen.
Oh, I just wanted to iterate that there is often a lot of confusion about what public engagement is. It's actually a word that's used a lot, very sloppily. And, you see this great ethics guidelines report, and then they say, we need to do public engagement. And then nobody really knows what that means. And there wasn't a public engagement specialist in the room. So with our global neuroethics group, for instance, we did a whole year of analysis, actually a couple of years now on public engagement and neuroethics engagement and the state of the art. But to your point about, I think it's common for many people to confuse public engagement with education. We'll just share this information with them in one direction, and then they'll know, and they'll suddenly understand what we scientists know, for example, and they will come along with us. And actually, it's about also understanding is getting people to the point where they can meaningfully engage. So you would inform on certain topics, and you would ask the so-called experts also to get oriented around how to communicate more effectively these complex ideas, because in the end, these are ideas that are going to impact and be enacted in a practical way and need to be able to be discussed in those ways. And like Arlene said, this can be a mutually informing dialogue that shapes the design. It doesn't have to dictate, but it certainly should inform, especially something like rights discourse.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I think that engagement is very important, and really for in the case of Chile, for the reasons that Pablo mentioned, which is related to how alien seems all this discussion to Chilean and also Argentinian citizens, perhaps for bringing those issues down to earth. So.
And can I just say, I think one thing that we've learned in the United States after the January 6th insurrection was that there are soft laws and soft cultural norms, and we presume the law would protect us from all kinds of things, and it's really the goodwill of people behaving in a democratic way. And that requires really a good public engagement. So if you don't involve the public prospectively, and they don't feel like they have a part in crafting whatever you guys come up with, there's no reason to believe that they're going to adhere to the final product. They have to feel like they've been engaged. So it's not only good to get the policy right and getting people's involvement, but it's also important for whether or not it's going to be enforceable and workable on the other side once it is a law or a policy. And it's kind of a civics education, right? It educates people not only in science, but science and society. It could be a tool for education and deliberative democracy. Not only are we going to talk about substance, we're going to demonstrate how you do talk about these issues. And that's important for countries that are either discovering democracy or reaffirming their democracy. And I say that without being a cultural imperialist, because the United States needs much of the same as well right now.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, in this moment we are in Chile in a very particular moment, rewriting the constitution from the scratch. So this is also why we think that it's a good moment to think about these foundational issues, and not because there will be these considerations will shape the constitution itself, but perhaps to think what kind of society we want in this particular moment in Chile. We can move on to our final issue, which is the scope of neuro rights. And here I have a couple of questions that I have to say some of these questions were actually discussed in the Senate Commission. For instance, this was one of them regarding the protection of agency and autonomy. Where do you think we should draw the line between ethical and unethical technological modulation of behavior? How political propaganda or commercial ads, other forms of influence, are different from neurotechnological or other digital forms of influence? What do you think about that? Or do you think that there is a difference between those different kinds of influence? Because well, the issue was mostly when technological modulation of behavior was unethical. I mean, and that wasn't clear because of cases such as the one I just mentioned, like propaganda and ads. Yes, Philip, please.
Yeah, I think that's very difficult question, because you would have to clarify, as you say, what kinds of behavioral modifications you would find acceptable from a moral point of view, ethical point of view, because in a sense you could say an intervention like a school or schooling is also a kind of behavioral modification, because what it does is that we expect that it has some kind of educative, civilizing effect on our kids. At least I hope. In some sense, that's why I sent them there. But I think that's the general expectation, that schools are not only for learning, but also by interacting with peers, by learning about social norms, by learning about the history of your country. You not only become educated, but that the education has the byproduct that you also have also become civilized, and that you maybe learn what kinds of behaviors are acceptable in peer groups and society at large. So education is the oldest form of behavior modification that we have, in a sense. And so it's all a matter of degree, or like In medicine, we have the very old doctrine to say it's the dosage that makes the toxin. Like from Paracelsus, ancient Greek medicine. So you have to be very specific and look what kinds of interventions are we talking about here. A good example is, for example, the question between legal or illegal drugs, because social and cultural norms are changing over time. What we now consider to be legal in many contexts, we considered to be very different many years ago. So these cultural norms about what are acceptable levels of behavioral modification change. And so I think we need to have a constant engagement with this question, and in a way that Aline outlined, is not only top down from the experts or experts talking to politicians, but this is a question that concerns all of society. Because I mean, we are faced with a situation now that medicine is becoming more science-based every day, yet trust in medical professionals and medicine as an institution is at an all-time low in almost all countries that have been polled. So whereas in the 1950s or 60s, a lot of medicine was not very scientific and was more eminence-based than evidence-based, people had a much higher level of trust. Now we face the problem that science itself and medicine itself, so institutions that we thought were more or less untouchable, are now in deep crisis. And so I think this is a very difficult discussion where I don't think there's a clear answer to say this is acceptable and this is not acceptable. Look at the history of psychosurgery. I mean, this alone, what psycho-civilized society, Joe, you're giving these wonderful talks about Delgado and the visions that he and others had, how we may civilize societies through neurotechnology. I mean,
actually, I have a paper coming out in the Neuroscientist as we speak, where I did archival research on Delgado and Walter Friedman. And Delgado was actually a liberal. His notion of psycho-civilizing society wasn't that he was going to put electrodes in everybody's brain. He really wanted to understand what caused people to become violent. And he was actually progressive, and he had been a Republican during the Spanish Civil War. He'd been incarcerated by the fascists, and his story, I did a primary archival research through his correspondence with John Fulton, who was his mentor at Yale. So stay tuned for that. I think people have conflated the argument was that they've conflated Walter Friedman and Delgado erroneously, and Walter Friedman was a monster, and Delgado was very, very different. So stay tuned. It's a very interesting story. And for my friends who are watching in Spain, one of the things that I learned was that Delgado was a protege of Juan Negrín, who was the president of the Spanish Republic, and was obviously on the Republican side. So it's a very interesting story. I will not belabor that, but I know we have a Spanish audience, so estará muy interesante.
Thank you very much, Joe. I had like a follow-up question, which is related to the previous one, which also about drawing lines, and in this case is related to discrimination. I know that Dita Farahani had a very interesting take regarding this question, and I wanted to know what do you think about this regarding the protection against discrimination, where we should draw the line between the legitimate assessment of cognitive performance in labor or educational contexts and unethical discriminatory practices based on neural or mental profiling. The idea is discrimination only unethical when it is epistemically flawed, that is, when it is grounded on bias, unjustified belief, or insufficient evidence, or are there situations in which profiling is completely accurate and nonetheless discrimination on the basis of profiles can be unethical? I think that's a good. Arlene.
I just want to make a very quick question about discrimination. It seems to me that it depends on people's understanding of discrimination. For some people define discrimination as unjustly treating others. So if that's the definition, of course, discrimination is wrong always, regardless. But you know, when I think of, I had a daughter, and I was trying to educate her so she could discriminate between what is right and what is wrong. And in that sense, discrimination is really trying to understand differences when there are differences. So, and that's the meaning that I favor. I think that discrimination can be good or bad, ethical or unethical. Discrimination based on biases, of course, is wrong. But I do believe that on a daily basis, we discriminate. We discriminate as teachers, we discriminate as citizens, we discriminate all the time. The issue becomes for me when such discrimination is unjustified. And that's when I feel that in that case, discrimination is wrong. But I would never say discrimination by definition is morally unacceptable.
Thank you, Arlene. And so do you think that in every situation in which discrimination is not based on bias, it would be okay to for instance, in a labor or educational context? Or?
I mean, I would hope that before hiring a lifeguard, whoever actually hires a person would discriminate and choose only those who know how to swim. I mean, that would be, I would not support somebody who says, hey, I don't want to discriminate in this respect. Again, it seems to me that it's very contextual. Now, if somebody says, I'm not hiring this person because he's a redhead, that's wrong, right? That's not the reason, that's not the relevant category. So I think that the permissibility of discrimination depends on the category involved. What are the reasons for it? But again, I'm looking forward to your different views on this.
I think the proof is in the pudding. Right. I mean, if somebody showed up and wanted to be a lifeguard and they were very heavy set and they looked like they were out of shape, and based on that perception, one said, well, I don't think this person could be a lifeguard because he might float, but he can't swim, without an objective test for his swimming ability or her swimming ability, that would be discriminatory. Right. So I think, you know, I agree with what Arlene said in principle, but it's in practice that we be very careful about things like implicit bias. You know, one of the things that really was very disturbing to me, going back to the pandemic, was you know, I was in New York during the spring surge, and we had all kinds of challenges about the SOPA score, you know, to allocate scarce resources, and we didn't end up implementing it, but it seemed like it was the best of all the worst possible scenarios at the time. But later on, I did a deep dive into the SOPA score, and there was all kinds of implicit bias towards people who lacked consciousness or had disorders of consciousness. The scale itself, which seemed so objective, right, actually had all kinds of problems. In the scoring, it was actually using the wrong metric to assess consciousness, not the coma recovery scale, but the Glasgow scale, and on and on and on. I wrote a paper about that in the Journal of Philosophy and Disability recently, and so I think, you know, the challenge is, you know, you don't want to be you want to discriminate. We might call that constructively risk stratifying, right, in a different framework. But it so easily becomes discriminatory, and things that we even think that are objective can themselves have implicit bias that's embedded into what seemingly seems to be an objective metric.
Thank you very much. So now Isabel had a question also related.
I think Karen and Philip had their hand.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, sorry.
Please, Karen or Philip.
Oh. I wanted to add that I think this is something we've also learned during the pandemic, that a lot of people don't know what science is.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand the difference between a scientific method and a scientist. So, you know, a lot of times people say they believe in science. You know, I think that starts to get dangerous territory too, basically, you know, and I'm trained as an analytical chemist first. I love to measure stuff, right? And then I did neurophysiology, so I love to get in there and quantify. But you have to remember that always, science tries to not be biased. It tries to adhere to a methodology. That's what unites us as scientists. And we're humans doing science, and humans have biases. And the important thing is to acknowledge them, not to suggest you don't have any. And biases aren't also inherently bad. I mean, sometimes you need to inject bias into a system to improve the situation that was caused by bias, right? So I think we need to really think carefully about the distinction about the process and the technology and the humans doing that work. And also think about, it's very enticing to quantify everything. And, I think about this being popularized actually by Silicon Valley and California, and everybody, the quantified self, and now we can quantify everything, even your brain activity, which could have a lot of value. But there might be some things that just aren't so easily quantified, and maybe there are some things that shouldn't be. And I think that's something to consider in this process as well. Like, what are the limits of what we can quantify, and what are limits of what we can understand when we do try to quantify? And I think those questions aren't always systematically explored by scientists or by people utilizing the technology.
Thank you very much, Karen. Philip, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so maybe a thing that is sort of implicit in the notion of discrimination is our ability to now understand much better the diversity of our brain, of our neurological phenotypes, the range of abilities, behavioral expressions that we have. But there's also a danger in that what is sometimes called neuroessentialism, or what Fernando Vidal called the cerebral subject, that we reduce humans to the way that their brain works, their brain functions, or their brain is made up in terms of structure and function. And so I think there are good nuances in terms of terms like neurodiversity, where we take an inclusive mindset and say we cherish the diversity of the neurophenotype, but that there's also always an undercurrent and danger that we reduce humans to the way their brain works and functions, where we are essentially, in essence, also relational beings that live in relationships with others, that are embedded in families, often in work life, in other social circles. And so I think we should maybe avoid to categorize people purely in terms of their neurological makeup and how they function neurologically, but look at it sort of from a broader perspective, and to recognize them as full human beings that are embedded in complex web of social relationships. And so this perspective may immunize us a little bit to sort of discriminate purely on the basis of neurophenotype, because if you have neurotechnology on a larger scale, it will come out that you have much more subtle groups, people that may belong in the same sort of category in terms of how their brain functions and is made up, where we should not fall into the trap to sort of then categorize people according to these measurements. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Philip. We have now two final questions, which are both related to a topic that we haven't discussed, which is neural enhancement. So I don't know if you, Pablo and Isabel, agree, but perhaps you can ask both questions and we can discuss them together. First, Isabel, and then Pablo, perhaps.
Well, I'm agree, no problem. I can make the question. Well, this year, Jerome Wakefield pointed out that one of the functions of psychiatrists today is human enhancement. In this sense, do you believe that neurorights could benefit mental health, or they rather could be detrimental in some respect? Perhaps they could be a counterbalance to the power given to psychiatry, especially in the management of pharmacological neuroenhancement?
And yeah, the final question is a little bit more philosophical or anthropological. It has to do with the relationship between enhancement an improvement, because some authors within the transhumanist tradition have actually claimed that enhancement is a way of transcending our current limitations. It's something like a going beyond what is meant to be human. So do you think the creation of neural rights is going to impact the way in which we define humanity? Do you think that the reflection about our own anthropology is going to be influenced by this crusade? So should the creation of a specific neural right be accompanied by a specific definition of what is meant by enhancement, or the distinction between enhancement and, let's say, leveling something?
I think, sorry, go ahead.
I would like to make just a short comment. Even before we talk about enhancement and leveling, the discussion on neural rights is premised under the assumption that emerging neurotechnologies will alter humanity. In papers on neural rights, there is usually reference to the extent to which humanity is going to be altered and human beings are going to change. I think that if that is a starting point, before even going further, we need to understand what is a human being exactly, and what is it that is going to be changed, and why that change is morally problematic. So for me, is not the discussion as to what we are as humans is not necessarily tied to neural rights or the creation of neural rights, but because the neural rights debate uses the idea of the human quite a bit, probably rhetorically, it doesn't matter, but because it is used, I think it calls for a more anthropologically oriented discussion. So that's the point that I wanted to make regarding this.
Thank you, Arlene. I think that Joe wanted to.
Yeah, no, I think this.
Joe wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think this is an example of putting the problem backwards. I mean, the issue of enhancement is complicated enough to then raise it in the context of neural rights. Just frames it in a certain narrow way, and it's richer than that. There are a lot of people who are deeply troubled by the idea of neuro enhancement and the conflation of neuroenhancement with neurotherapeutics or restoration. I mean, sometimes people talk about, neuro restoration synonymously with neuroenhancement, when in fact they're completely different things. So I think this goes back to that definitional issue of getting our categories straight. You're creating a very narrow frame. It's kind of like principlism in bioethics. You've got 4 principles. You got to put the whole world into those 4 principles. The world is more complicated than 4 principles. So thinking about the issue about whether the ethical propriety of enhancement through the framework of rights really constrains the debate, I believe, and it's much richer than that. Because we could debate what do you mean by enhancement, so I think it's problematic, and that's another reason for prudence in enacting any laws prematurely before you have your categories clear. And I think the final point is, I think it's very important that this not be done on a nation-to-nation basis. We're in a global community. These technologies are global. These conversations must be global. So it's kind of a neuroethical nationalism for a single country to do this. And maybe nationalism is the word that we were looking for before. I don't know. So I think we've got to be very careful.
Thank you very much. Yes, Karen, please.
I wanted to say this. I feel like I couldn't close or jump off without this, that I'm really grateful for the leadership that you and many of the people on this call have taken in the conversation around neuro rights. It's an exceptionally complicated one. And I'd probably be too scared to handle it if I didn't know I had friends that I could trust working on it. So thank you for that. And I think, you know, having this happen in Chile has been really informative also for the world in that way. And, you know, what can we learn? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are the, I mean, you don't really know until you get in the weeds there. And I'm really grateful for that and for the stewardship that I know that you're working on and that your group is working on, and those on this line are. And thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas that I have on this, and so enriched by the others who have also shared their ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you all for participating in this roundtable. It has been really useful roundtable. All of your insights. We with Pablo and Isabel probably will be working on your insights on all the questions. And thank you very much. Well, we have just finished addressing the last issue. So thank you to the attendees for attending the roundtable, the regulation of neurotechnology in Chile. We hope that through our conversation, we managed to understand better the key philosophical, scientific, and legal questions that have been raised during the discussion of the Chilean project. So we'll analyze the panelist insights, as I said, with the aim of developing conceptual tools for addressing them and contributing to our local discussion on neuroprotection, and also to the regional debate that includes other national proposals, such as the ones recently proposed by Brazil and much more recently by Argentina. So please stay tuned to our social media for information about forthcoming activities of the UAH Neuroethics Group and the ANID Research Project exploring the conceptual foundations of neuro rights. So have a very nice weekend.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks so much for the invitation.